heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 277, covering the week of August 30th through September 3rd, 2021. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab page, and subscribe to our YouTube page where you can find this podcast and a lot of other great material, lectures. We've got all kinds of great stuff out there. Also, go to abbevilleinstitute.org. You can donate to the Institute. Click on that button where you can give us an email address. Get that free gift Exploring the Southern Tradition, where you will get our daily dose of Dixie Monday through Friday. You'll give us an email address. You'll get the free ebook, and then you'll get on our email list. But that also is a conduit for donating to the Institute. So you have that donate tab at abbevilleinstitute.org. If you like what we do, if you like our podcasts, our conferences, our website, our videos, all the stuff that we try to do, our books that we're producing now, all these things, well, they exist because you donate money. And I say this every week, but we do exist on your generous contributions alone. So please consider a tax-deductible donation to the Institute. Also, download our free mobile app. There's a link for that on the website as well. Get us on the go. Go out to your app store, whether it's Apple or Google, and simply look for Abbeville Institute. You'll come up with our app, so you can get the Institute on the go. And share our material around on social media. Right now, we don't have a Facebook presence, but a lot of you are on Facebook. It doesn't hurt to put our material up there and let your friends know about it. That's not a bad thing. If you're on Gab, do that. If you're on Twitter, do that. Share it around. Let people know you like the Abbeville Institute and you like our mission to explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. And as always, we have some great stuff this week, and I think it's really good. And what we did this week was a little different. We had 3 what would be considered primary documents this week, in addition to our ongoing series on What Makes This Musician Great by Tom Daniel, and a piece that was published in 1998 by John Shelton Reed. Now, John Shelton Reed is just a great Southerner. He's been around a long time. He is a fantastic humorist. And this particular piece he wrote in 1998 in Reason Magazine. And I had somebody contact us and say, well, you got to be careful with Reason Magazine. Well, this is true. I mean, modern Reason Magazine has got some problems. But this particular piece, I mean, first of all, it's 1998, so it's a long time ago. This particular piece is getting into the overreach of government and a particular part of Southern culture that has definitely disappeared since 1998, and that is the front porch, right? Nobody really sits on the front porch anymore. Nobody goes outside and they sit on the front porch and they talk to their neighbors and they do things. And I think in some ways we've almost become hostile to that. We don't want to be bothered with people talking to us, our next door neighbors, and it becomes a problem. But that front porch, I mean, it was a way to ensure that your neighborhood was well kept up, that people were doing what they were supposed to do, that people were friendly, that you knew about people, you knew who was there, you knew who your neighbors were, you knew when things were going bad and going good. I mean, you knew all this stuff. And Shelton Reed talks about how in Carolinas, this is, again, years ago, they tried to ban couches on the front porch. You had to have a certain kind of furniture. It couldn't just be your old lazy boy on the front porch. It had to be certain, it had to have a certain style to it. So the poor person that can't go to the store and get your nice wicker furniture or something and put it out there. But, outdoor furniture certainly has changed over the last 20 years. People do have outdoor furniture, and usually it looks pretty nice now. I mean, they try to get, nice outdoor furniture, but that stuff's expensive, so maybe they just stuck their old lazy boy out there. Maybe it's their old upholstered furniture that they couldn't keep inside anymore, so they stuck it outside. We know there's problems with this. It gets bugs and lizards and all kinds of stuff in it, and it starts to get ratty if it gets wet. So you want to have furniture that's going to last, and so you can understand the concern with people in the community of having these eyesores on a porch. On the other hand, by keeping people off the front porch, it's also created an environment that is anti-Southern in a lot of ways. And I think that's the point that John Shelton Reed was attempting to make here. And when you read John Shelton Reed, he's just so good. I mean, it reminds you a lot of Louis Grizzard, and these Southern humorists. And in that vein, we had a primary document at the end of the week on Friday from a Mississippi congressman who was named a private, quote unquote, private John Allen. John Allen served in the United States Congress, again from Mississippi. He was always known as Private John Allen because he was a private during the war. He was someone who never went above the rank of private during the War for Southern Independence. And he used that to his advantage. There was a funny anecdote with John Allen where he was asked, why did the South lose the war, essentially, or something along those lines. And he said he thought about it for a minute. He was on stage. It was a reunion. He was on stage there, and there was a whole bunch of people there who were officers, generals, colonels, officers in the Confederate military. And he looked around and he said, well, I guess I could say that I was Private John Allen throughout the entire war, and I'm on the stage with all these distinguished generals, colonels, majors, all these people, and I was never made General John Allen, and that's probably why we lost the war. I mean, he was making fun of the fact that he can't really speak because he's not one of these guys that really lost the war. He went out there and fought, and they never made him General John Allen, so he would have done things differently. That's funny, right? He was a funny, and the South has this humorous tradition. And I'm gonna wrap this back around to, we're talking about humor and music, comedy and music first, because to get people interested in the South, you have to go where they are, and certainly telling jokes is one of that. Music is another, art is another, literature is another. And then there's the political side of it. And there's this positive political side of it, which we'll get to in the Jefferson letter that we published this week. And then, of course, there's also a piece by a former, now, of course, he's dead, but when he wrote it, a future Supreme Court justice from the South. But I want to read this little story from John Allen. And it shows the complexity of the South in terms of race relations as well. What was happening. John Allen, here's a guy serving in the Congress from 1885 to 1901. So right at the height of Jim Crow, right? I mean, this is right when we had segregation, or, when it first started. Segregation, you can say the height. I mean, the height might have been 20th century, but certainly you're starting to see it here in the 1870s, 80s, 90s. It's often said 1890s, brutal time in the South with Jim Crow and segregation and other things. And here's a guy from Mississippi, and he writes this story, and you see some complexity in race relations here. So I'm going to read this. He says, I want to tell you of the greatest legal victory of my life, said Allen once to a group of congressmen. It was down in Tupelo, just after the war. So we're talking about, 1860s, Tupelo, Mississippi. I was at that time a practicing lawyer. That is, I practiced when I had any cases to practice with. One day, Uncle Pompey, a Negro of the settlement, came into my office and said, Marster John, I want you to clear me. I was going to be arrested for stealing 2 hams out of the Crossroads store. Well, Pompey, did you really steal the hams? Master John, I just took them. Did anyone see you? Yes, boss, said the man discontentedly, 2 old white buck rats. Well, Pompey, I replied, I can't do anything for you under these circumstances. Now, Master John, said old Pompey, here's $10. I just want you to try. Well, I consented to try, said Allen. So, hey, I don't think I'm going to, if somebody saw you take the hams, you're going to get arrested, and there's nothing I can do for you. I mean, really, it's clean, it's open and shut case. He said, well, I just want you, here's $10, which was a lot of money in 1867. I just want you to try. Okay, well, I'll take your $10 and I'll try. The thing is, he didn't just try. He figured out how to win the case. The case was to be heard before an old magistrate named Johnson. He was totally uneducated and was moreover a perfect dictator. So this is how he describes the judge: totally uneducated and a perfect dictator. Why? Because he said this: no Negro ever came before him who was not fined the maximum penalty. So this guy is a brute because of what he does to black people, right? Think about that. And this is a guy from Mississippi telling this story. In 1880s, 1890s, I can't remember the exact date that he told the story, but in that time period when you would say everybody in the South would have been doing everything they could to hurt black people in the South. The magistrate heard the case. That Pompey stole the hams, there can be no doubt from the testimony. I did not cross-examine the witness. But when the testimony was all in, I arose and in my most dignified manner addressed the magistrate. May it please your honor, if it would be useless for me to argue the position my client now holds, and before one who would adorn the superior, if not the supreme bench of this grand old commonwealth, and I might say that those who know you best say that you would grace even the Supreme Court of the United States. He's saying, hey, it'd be useless for me to argue otherwise. You're such a brilliant judge. You would be on the Supreme Court of Mississippi, if not the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest tribunal in all the land. I can't even imagine arguing against this. It will be useless to dwell upon the testimony. You have heard it and know the case as well as I do. However, it may not be out of order, for me to call your honor's attention to a short passage in the Old English law, which clearly decides the case, and which, for the moment, your honor may have forgotten. So, hey, if you'll let me read from the Old English law, I think I could persuade you that this is the wrong decision. I mean, all the things we've heard, but this would be the wrong decision based on this Old English law. Then I fished down into my pocket and drew forth with a great flourish an old copy of Julius Caesar, right? So he pulls out Shakespeare. Julius Caesar. Now remember, this judge, he's just flattered the judge. This guy's so smart. But before he went in, he said, this guy's as stupid as you can get. A dictator. This guy's worthless, right? So he pulls out a copy of Julius Caesar, knowing the judge can't read. I opened it with great dignity and read the line familiar to every schoolboy. And I'm going to do it in English. Gaul was divided in 3. That's the line. In Latin, he reads it. Omnia Gallia in partes tre divisa est. He closed the book. That decides the case, said I, throwing the book upon the table. That clearly acquits the defendant. So he says, by reading Julius Caesar, Gaul was divided in 3, and slams the book down. That's it. My client is not guilty. With great dignity and a solemn nature, I took my seat. The old magistrate was completely nonplussed. He looked at me a moment quizzically and scratched his head. Then turning to Pompey, he raised himself to his full height and said, Pompey, I know you stole them hams, but by the ingenuity of your lawyer, I've got to let you go. Get out. If you ever come here again, lawyer or no lawyer, you got 6 months. So he flatters the man. You are so smart. I'm going to pull out this thing from Old English law, and I'm going to read this, and this proves my client's not guilty. So the guy can't admit that he doesn't know what it means. Well, this is your lawyer knows what he's talking about, and because of that, you got to go. So this is a great little funny story, poking fun at this dictator of a judge who might have been Republican. Who even knows? Might have been some carpetbagger. I don't know. And here's Allen getting the guy acquitted, even though he stole the hams. Admitted he stole the hams. Yeah, I stole them, but I need you to get me off here. I don't want to go to jail. So this shows the complexity of the South and race relations in the South. And I think that's a fun little, and the comedy is important, right? I mean, comedy is a way to disarm people. People might look at that piece and say, oh gosh, it's got dialect in it, so it's racist. Or, I mean, this is what happens when you get even Faulkner now. I mean, you have dialect writing that's racist. But people were trying to portray how people spoke and acted and interacted in the South. And that was important. It was actually seen as preserving black culture in the South rather than being condescending with it. So that was a really good piece. And and then of course we had the piece on Robert Johnson this week. What makes this musician great? Robert Johnson, a blues musician. And what I found really interesting, I've never been a big Robert Johnson fan, but again, a lot of people have really enjoyed Robert Johnson. And he became very popular in the 1960s when you had all these British guitarists, more importantly, rediscovering American blues. And then if you look at all the British invasion bands, I mean, most of them started as blues bands, particularly the ones that got into, hard rock sound or that kind of sound. They started as blues bands, Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin was always a blues band. It's Cream. They all had this blues sound to them because that was authentically American, and that blues guitar was something that really, really spoke to them. Now, Tom Daniel mentioned last week with Carl Perkins that there will be no Beatles without Carl Perkins. So the Beatles are certainly influenced by American music too, but a little different side of it. But all these British bands wouldn't have been anything without American rock, country, rockabilly, whatever you want to say. This was the music that kept them and made them who they were. And so that's what and now Robert Johnson, again, I haven't been a big fan, but he points out what makes Robert Johnson great is the way he can sing. Now, he's a good guitar player, but he's playing simple blues guitar, but it's the way he sings. He sings off note, which creates a haunting sound that's amazing, right? And I think that's where people go to Robert Johnson, and they really like the way that he does that. As Tom says at the end of the piece, he says, straight up, this song is a musical nightmare. It's the kind of song that's uncomfortable to listen to late at night, alone, and with the lights out. Robert Johnson takes his cues from his own disturbing lyrics for making both his voice and his guitar howl. There are howls of pain as well as howls of pursuit, and this song is a chiller. The bass notes kept repeating over and over, indicative of a relentless pursuit, while the bottleneck slide creates the high-pitched howling sound. I mean, this is the sound of Robert Johnson that made him so famous. But he concludes by saying Robert Johnson did not invent the blues, and he came along too late to be considered for the early development of blues. By the time he was first recorded in 1936, all of the format known as 12-bar blues was already firmly established. However, what Robert Johnson brought to the table was an eerie mastery of the guitar that transformed standard blues into something haunting and intense, which would directly inspire generations of guitarists in the 1950s and 60s and beyond. Simply put, Robert Johnson was more than a blues pioneer. He was a blues guitar pioneer. And I think that's where you get to the... But this is the South, right? I mean, there would be no Robert Johnson without the South. And all these British bands and guitarists are influenced by the Southern tradition, whether they know it or not. And this always reminds me, and if you go back and you read Eugene Genovese, Roll Jordan Roll, and he talks about religion and things like voodoo and hoodoo, which certainly came out of black traditions in the South. There was this old movie, well, old, not really old, but came out maybe early 2000s. I can't remember maybe 90s, early 2000s. I can't remember the exact year, but The Skeleton Key. And it kind of gets into this stuff. Blues music. And the story is, I mean, the twist at the end is so good. And it's a kind of a horror movie, but it's really good if you like that kind of stuff. The Skeleton Key is interesting. And but it gets into this relationship with music and hoodoo and voodoo in Southern black communities, and I think Robert Johnson really fulfills that, and that connection to that, whether you like it or not. Certainly, people are influenced by the Southern tradition in one way or another with these things, and that I think is important to show how important the South is for all kinds of things in American society. So now I want to go to the last couple of things of the week, and I want to talk about this letter from Thomas Jefferson, written June 24th, 1826. This is the last letter he ever wrote. He died 10 days later. And I think this is really interesting. Because one of the debates about the South is how America, I should say overall, is how America is a proposition nation. This is what Lincoln said. America is a proposition nation. And it's based on this proposition that all men are created equal. And Jefferson believed that. I mean, he was firmly committed to that, and all these other states were committed to it. And it's just that the South lost this. And that Jefferson, that was the most important line for Jefferson. And he talked a lot about it. But here is the last letter Jefferson wrote in June of 1824. And he talks about what the Declaration was about and why it was important. In fact, the title that we gave this piece was The Blessings and Security of Self-Government. Because at the end of the day, that was what made the South. It's what made America. And I find this piece very interesting for that. So this is a short letter, 2 paragraphs. I want to read it. Respected Sir, the kind invitation received from you on the part of the citizens of the city of Washington to be present with them at their celebration of the 50th anniversary of American independence, as one of the surviving signers of an instrument pregnant with our own and the fate of the world, is most flattering to myself and heightened by the honorable accompaniment proposed for the comfort of such a journey. It adds sensibility to the sufferings of sickness to be deprived by it of a personal participation in the rejoicing of that day. But acquiescence is a duty, under circumstances not placed among those who are permitted to control. I should indeed with peculiar delight have met and exchanged their congratulations personally with the small band, the remnant of that host of worthies who joined with us on that day in the bold and doubtful election we were to make for our country, between submission or the sword, and to have enjoyed with them the consolatory fact that our fellow citizens, after half a century of experience and prosperity, continue to approve the choice we made. Think of what he said there. Here is Jefferson in his 80s, looking back, saying it would be great to go meet with these old men one more time. One more time. And say, gosh, we did something. Look at what we did. And people still 50 years later admire this because it was the choice between submission or the sword. That was the choice. It wasn't about human rights. He mentions something like this a little later in the letter. But it wasn't that. This was independence. He says, may it be to the world what I believe it will be to some part sooner, to others later, but finally to all, the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition have persuaded them to bind themselves and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. May it be to the world what I believe some part sooner than later, right? The signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition has persuaded them to bind themselves and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. The Declaration is about independence, the blessings and security of self-government. This is what it's all about. It's not about human rights or natural law. No. What he hoped with the Declaration would be a model to other peoples around the world to gain the right of self-government. That's what it would have been. That form which we have substituted restores the free right to the unbound exercise of reason and freedom of opinion. I mean, this is what it did. Self-determination gave us reason and freedom of opinion. All eyes are open, or opening, to the rights of man. Now, what do the rights of man mean? He explains it. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs. The rights of man is that you're born free, right? I mean, that's what he's saying there. You're born free. And you're not to be ridden by some privileged few. That's what he thought the rights of man were. He doesn't say this thing about equality, but you're born free. And, of course, Jefferson didn't believe that because of slavery and other things. Jefferson always qualified that. Right of nature, society. But certainly the most important part of this entire thing was the right and blessings of self-government, security of self-government. These are grounds of hope for others. For ourselves, let the annual return of this day forever refresh our recollections of these rights and an undiminished devotion to them. These rights, the blessings and security of self-government. So let us hope that every July 4th we think of the blessings and security of self-government. Let's hope we do that. And let's hope that always continues to be part of the American spirit. We know it wasn't because we know there were groups that didn't believe that. And we also know it wasn't because we have the Union occupying the South who was simply looking for the blessings and security of self-government. Jefferson had a last paragraph, concluding paragraph, just a couple of sentences, when he said that his ill health, he can't go. He can't go. He's just too sick. And again, he dies 10 days later. But I found this letter interesting because we have this conversation, what this means, and you could maybe read into this the proposition nation myth, but you could also say that the first thing he talks about is self-government. That's what the Declaration was all about. The rights of man came second, but self-government protected those things. That's what it was all about. And then you look at the last piece, it's actually the Wednesday piece, but by L.Q.C. Lamar, who again was a Supreme Court justice. It's a comparison of Washington and Lee. Now, Lamar was asked by a committee to give an address. This is December of 1870, right after Lee had died, and to go to Vicksburg and give an address. Lamar is from Mississippi. He said he couldn't do it. And so what he did in this is compare Lee to Washington. And he had some pretty harsh things to say about George Washington, but wonderful things to say about Robert E. Lee. In fact, he said the day of his death will be the anniversary of the South's great sorrow, but it was not his darkest day. I was at Appomattox when the flag which I had been born in triumph upon his many battlefields, was torn from his loving and reluctant grasp. After the terms of capitulation had been arranged, chance brought him to the spot where my tent was pitched. I had seen him often before. On one occasion especially, I remember how he appeared in a consultation of leading men, where, amid the greatest perturbances, his mind seemed to repose in magic poise and serenity. Again, I saw him immediately after one of his grand battles, with the light of victory shone upon his brow. But never shall I forget how completely his wanton composure was overthrown in this last sad interview. Every lineament of his grand face writhed, and the big tears fell from his eyes as he spoke of the anguish of the scene he had just witnessed. And yet his whole presence breathed the hero still. A consciousness of great calmity to be greatly endured gave to his face the grandeur of victory as well as the mournfulness of death. And when he exclaimed, "It is worse than death," I could easily see how he would have welcomed the grave for himself and all that he loved, could it have only averted his country's awful woe. I mean, this is beautiful, that he's saying Lee was overwhelmed with grief. And when he compares Lee to Washington, he says both were patriots, but Washington stood before the world an avowed revolutionist. The moment he led was an acknowledged insurrection against established authority. He drew his sword to sever the connection between colonies and their parent country, between subjects and their legitimate sovereign, a connection that rested on historic foundation and on undisputed legal rights. That's an interesting position from Lamar, because Washington was really a conservative revolutionary, quote-unquote, but you could make the case that there was a stronger attachment to the British colonies, to the crown, than what existed between the states and the United States Central Authority. But then he says, but there was not in Lee or his cause one single element of revolutionary rebellion. Conservative in his nature and education and associations, unswerving in his loyalty to the power which for him was paramount to all others, the cause and defense of which he drew his sword was founded upon historic rights, constitutional law, public morality, and the inviolable right of free and sovereign states, many of whose constituents were established and in peaceful operation, while that of the United States lay unthought of in the far-off years of futurity. This was a different situation. Lee was leading a war, not a revolution, not a rebellion, but an act of self-determination. Lamar said he has already taken his place in history, not as an American, but as a Southern patriot and martyr, of whom America was not worthy. Think about that. We just had, as I'm recording this, the state of Virginia Supreme Court has said that the Lee Monument can come down on Monument Avenue. And here's Lamar saying that America was not even worthy of Lee. Is Richmond today even worthy of Lee? So these monuments, I mean, in some ways, you can say that Richmond's not worthy of Lee, Virginia's not worthy of Lee, or even Washington or Jefferson, no longer worthy of these men. So should we still have them there? I don't know. Every thought of his brain, every pulsation of his heart, every fold and fiber of his being was Southern. Not a drop but of pure Virginia blood flowed in his veins. Virginian, Southern, Confederate, secession, from crown to soul, he had no aspiration in common with America as America now is, or sympathy with her works as they now are. And from the day on which his venerable state seceded from the American Union, there was not an hour which he would not have gladly offered up life and all that life holds dear on the altar of Southern rights against American oppression. Think about what Lamar just said there. Could you not have said this in 2021? He had no aspiration in common with America as America now is, or sympathy with her works as they now are. So, having Lee in Richmond is emblematic of a different America, a different Virginia that doesn't exist anymore. So maybe having Lee there was not a thing that should be there. And Lamar is saying in 1870, the America that now exists doesn't even represent Lee in 1870. Lamar says, it has been said that General Lee belongs to civilization. Aye, but he belongs to civilization. But let it not be forgotten, for such will be the record of impartial history, that it was the Southern type of civilization which produced him. And now that a sublime self-immolation has fixed him on the topmost pinnacle of fame, let his immortal image look down forever upon the ages, the perfect representative of the mighty struggle, the glorious purpose, and the long-sustained moral principle of the heroic race from which he sprung. And that would be Virginians, Southerners. That's a beautiful summary of what Robert E. Lee was, and why, in so many ways, the left has to take him down, because he represents all that is the antithesis of what they are, and all that is noble in the American character, and there's no nobility in any of these people. Until next time.